what can we do to continue this amazing work that we've been doing here in our wonderful community. And over the last couple of years, especially throughout the pandemic, we were able to join our Commissioner of Education, Angelica Infante Green, on some real serious conversations around addressing the pipeline of teachers across the country, across the world, but more so looking at sort of BIPOC, the need in BIPOC communities or in low income, poor communities with students of color, and thinking about how we can impact that change. And so we thought, well, let's have a conversation with the Department of Education and see where they're at. And so I remember Mr. Flanagan, who was on that call way back in the day, a couple of other folks, and we never stopped thinking about it. And our goal for today is to have you help us sort of flesh this out a little bit more by way of how do we address the need for teachers to reflect the constituency of students that they serve in these communities. And one of our thoughts was, well, if we can't find them, then we'll have to make them. And so we thought, how do we create a strong program that we think would be of the caliber that is needed to have not only an adult in front of kids, but an adult in front of kids who can relate to our children's walk of life, that talk like them, that walk like them, that are kindred spirits, if you will. And so we started this process a little over a year ago to look at expanding Segway's model to a high school, and then expanding our catchment area to include Pawtucket, Providence, and Woonsocket, along with Central Falls. And so we've had some great conversations with some folks. We've looked at some really great models. Obviously, we brought Kiara on as part of her consulting group, and we have been planning and just having meetings of the minds to see how we can make this happen. So congratulations, you're in on the very first official public meeting for the Legacy High School. Our goal at the Legacy High School is not just to create teachers. It is about having change agents and looking at really having a conversation around education as a construct. And what does that mean for kids of lower income communities and kids of color, and the education that is before them? Is that their education? Is that their history? Is that their journey? And then really creating a population of people who push the envelope. Segway has been that school since day one that has, stood up and answered the call of kids and families about engagement and being mindful and being culturally sensitive and diverse. And I think because of that, we have changed the landscape of education locally and statewide. And so I'm super, super excited about having you all here. This is a safe space, so please feel free to speak your truth and talk about what drives you to be a part of this. If you can be a part of this and help us to move this along, this is much, much more than just an application to the Department of Education. This is a greater dialogue that I feel we can all be a part of. We are we walk the walk of kids in Central Falls every day. I'm a lifelong resident. A lot of our school founders and founding staff grew up in this community. And so we know of what we speak about when we talk our kids' journey. And I'm confident that a lot of you have the same kind of stories that we do. So again, I want to thank you for being here, and I want to thank you for sharing with us and being honest. You can't break it is my new motto this year at school. So all ideas are welcome, all thoughts, all feedback that you can offer to us. I remain grateful for people giving up their time. So I'm going to stop talking because I can talk all day. But thank you once again. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And I want to turn it back over to Kiara.
Thank you so much, Mr. Garcia. I'm just so delighted to see all of you here. I know it's going to be a great conversation today. I wanted to add just a little bit more clarity in terms of the parameters for timeline for us, as well as we plan for Legacy High School. And so there are a couple of kind of benchmark milestone dates that are really important. The first is coming up very soon, mid-September. Segway will be putting forward a shell of its application to the State Department of Education, which will serve as the guiding framework for how it wants to amend its existing charter to now serve a high school population. This will be the plan in which Segway has to articulate how it will meet all of the required different elements of an educational program to be approved and viable here in Rhode Island. And the process for getting approval of the school will then follow in the several months of the winter time coming after that, leading up until the spring of next year. However, the school has taken the stance that they are pushing forward no matter what in planning for this model in a way that's reflective as much as possible of both the community that they're serving and also the expertise that the state has. So we've received some preliminary, really exciting national funding, which unfortunately is embargoed, but we'll be able to share that soon with you all. And through that grant, we're going to be able to host 2 design teams, a student family design team, and then also a community of expert practitioners such as you all who are on this call, who will work together to take that shell of a plan, which really speaks to high level, how are we going to make the commitments to make this a strong place for students, to how are we going to take that one level deeper? What do community partners look like for this process? What is a portrait of the graduate we want to see? Who are the educators that we want to serve in this building? What does the schedule or work-based learning experiences look like that really foster support for the model? And so at the end of this time together, we'll introduce that design team opportunity to you all. We would love if any of you are interested in joining in that process or sharing with your networks with others who might be interested as well. And so just to verify that one more time, it's the touch point 1 of actually submitting the high level application and then taking the next year to really plan what does that look like for implementation together. And so one thing that I wanted to start out with all of the expertise and the different perspectives in the room is I'm going to drop a quick link into the chat for a Jamboard. And for those of you who are not familiar with Jamboard, this is essentially a digital whiteboard where we can share ideas and information together. And if you click into the Jamboard, there's an essential question just to start us off together. And I'll give you a moment to open that up, and I can also share my screen. And the question that's presented here is, what motivated your decision to pursue a career in education? And so in order to participate in the Jamboard, you can click on either the text box here or the sticky note, and you can write a quick note in here about what encouraged you to pursue a career in education. In answering this, I know many of you, like myself, do not consider yourselves to be traditional classroom educators, and that's okay. Mr. Garcia has been pushing both myself and others in this room to think about how we all serve as educators in different ways and how we leverage education for social change, regardless of whether that's in the classroom or in the sector at broad. So when I'm asking this question, it's not why did you decide to become a teacher, but it's really why did you decide to engage in education as a career as a whole. So I'll give you a minute to participate here together. And so I'm seeing some comments coming through. And what I love is already there's such a diversity in the different reasons why folks came to this. So some motivated by their own experience as a first generation college student, others thinking about individuals that they're serving and the impact that they would like to make with them. About sharing stories and seeing stories of impact that reflect their own. And I'm seeing such a strong focus on, supporting students that reflect our own backgrounds in ways that we might not have seen for ourselves. Great. So the Jamboard will continue to exist. And so please feel free to keep that open and running. I want to now move us into our panel discussion, which really builds off of this topic. Mr. Garcia wrote me a note, which is a really important one, which is that Segue is not entering into this work in a silo or believing that they're the only one approaching this work or that this is the start of this work. So many of you are engaging in this work in all different ways across the state. And so we just want to articulate how much we value that already and how we see that as an asset being brought to the table. And we also for this panel discussion, want to just set the tone and the stage a little bit, with the most important piece being that this is a personal conversation because we believe that our career trajectories towards education are personal decisions and our interactions with students are personal as well. And so when we have this conversation today, oftentimes we're talking big picture about, the organizational, operational, bureaucratic things that need to change in education. And all of those things are important and we'll get there. But in terms of our call to action today, we really want to have a conversation about the personal experiences that people bring to the table regarding this work. And so the first thing that I'm going to have us do is I'll just do a quick roll call of our panelists today. And when I call your name, if you don't mind, just quickly introducing yourself to the group as we're at all different levels of folks knowing each other here. And so I will start off with Carlin. Carlin, could you please introduce yourself?
Yes. Hello, everyone. My name is Carlin Howard. I serve as Chief Impact Officer with Equity Institute. And in my role, I focus on teacher diversity, educator recruitment, retention, with a particular emphasis on paraprofessionals and teacher assistants.
Great, thank you. Wendy, would you like to go next?
Yes, thank you, Kiara. Good morning, everyone. Wendy Wallace. I am the Director of Engagement and Development for the National Student Support Accelerator out of Brown University. And within my role, I have the honor and the privilege to disseminate our research findings around high impact tutoring and making it equitable for all students across the nation.
Awesome. Mimi?
Good morning, everybody. My name is Mimi Ziyani. I am the Director of School Culture and Community at Rhineye Middle College, downtown in Providence. I am proud to support over 300 students as they navigate education as well as the nursing and create a future that looks more like the community that we represent and live in.
Great. Jermaine?
Good morning, everybody. My name is Jermaine Curtis. I am the charter school specialist at RIDE. So happy to see some of my friends here today. And so I'm happy to be a part of this discussion. My role here, my office oversees the new CEAS process, which the Legacy High School will be a part of, as well as the renewal processes of all of the charter schools in our state. and just happy to be here, a part of the conversation.
Great, thank you. Dr. Rodriguez?
Hey, good morning. My name is Anthony. I'm a professor over at Providence College, former school teacher in the Albuquerque Public Schools and the Bureau of Indian Affairs, where I was administrator and a teacher. I'm very, very much interested in this process to hopefully get people like myself back in the classroom, and just great to be here.
Awesome, thank you. Keith?
Good morning, everyone. Keith Oliveira. I am the Executive Director of the Rhode Island League of Charter Schools. The mission of the league is to expand the role of charter schooling in the state of Rhode Island, and we represent 20 independent charter schools around the state, enrolling about 6,400 students. And so we provide advocacy support and statewide policy, as well as support to our individual member schools.
Awesome, thank you. Mr. Montoya?
Morning, folks. My name is Kevin Montoya. I'm actually a founding teacher here at the Segway Institute for Learning. Last couple of years, I had served as the principal of the elementary school, but currently for this school year, I'll be the Director of Culture and Engagement. The idea being that we want our families to take part in the education of their children. We want them also to experience what we offer, which are wraparound services for our students and families, because we know that our students, we need to ensure that our students' needs are being met so that they can access the learning that we provide. And so we really emphasize the importance of family engagement and create opportunities for them to be a part of our school community, and then bring students on that journey too of seeing their families in our school and taking part in that. And so, yeah, it's a commitment to be here at Segway. And so I'm happy to be here. I'm really excited about this next process as we continue to grow, and look forward to getting to know all of you.
Fantastic. And last but certainly not least, Kim.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Kim Bright, and I recently joined the team at Rhode Island College, where I serve as a senior advisor to the president. And in that capacity, I am helping the new interim president there with that transition and with some initiatives that are happening across the campus. Prior to that, I served as chief of staff for the state higher ed office and also chief of staff at RIDE. I'm really happy to join this conversation. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you so much. So this is going to be fairly informal. I'm going to kick us off, seeing if this can happen organically. But because there's so many of you, if I need to kind of intervene to call on people, I will. Otherwise, let's just, I'll just throw a question out there. So for our panel at large, feel free to jump in. I'd like to start just reflecting back on your own educational experience. Can you talk a bit about what your schooling experience was like for you? Anyone feel free to jump in.
Sure, I'm happy to kick it off. Yeah, so I actually grew up in the South in a rural town. So I went to a very small school in a community that was also mostly Black. So my school was 80% Black. Vast majority of kids who went to my school and lived in my community were generations going back to slavery. And interestingly enough, you know, and I never thought about poverty in the way I think about poverty now, but being in a rural community, everybody's kind of on the same level, right? So you never think about anybody being necessarily poor or rich, but more about, you know, we all seem to have the same thing, right? When I was in second grade, I took a test and I was identified as quote unquote intellectually gifted, which meant they put me into a special program. And as I mentioned, my school was 80% Black. Well, the gifted program was about 10% Black, I would say, 5% Black, right? In a school that's 80% Black. So, you know, at a young age, I saw the discrepancies between the haves and the have-nots, right? So it always was a fascinating thing. And I always felt like an outcast because I straddled this world between being in classes that were mostly white, but then obviously being in a community that was mostly Black. And it put me into a space where I was constantly like grappling with my identity as a person. You know, on one end, people were saying like, oh, you're acting white because you're doing well in school. And then on the other end, you know, I was never accepted because it's like, you know, I remember going to a pool, and this is the South, of course. And, you know, someone saying like, you know what, you're one of the good Blacks, right? So those were all the experience that led me to this point. I actually, throughout school, had good experiences with my teachers. I did well academically. I think one of the biggest challenges for me is that school in a way was a great space for me, but it also was a space where I was very challenged when it came to issues of society. So thinking about economics, thinking about politics, thinking about social factors. My father was also incarcerated at times in my life and struggled with addiction. And I only bring that up because my path to education actually came by way of my interest in the criminal justice system and addressing addiction and incarceration, and particularly among Black men. And, you know, for me, and, you know, some people call it survivor's remorse, I saw many of my peers who identified as me, grew up together, etc., either dead or in jail by the time we were 25. And for me, seeing that around me, the first person I ever saw or knew personally that got murdered, who was shot, was when I was in 9th grade, right? And that shouldn't be the case for kids. So with that in the background, I always had this deep interest in what does it mean to serve a cause much greater than yourself? What does it mean to be in this space of education when there's such drastic experiences of where people at based on geography, based on zip code, based on who you're going to school with, based on income level, all these things. But overall, like I said, it was this weird straddling this world of doing well academically and doing well in school, but all these other social, economic, political factors that were playing out that were also putting me in a very compromised position as a young person. And it's, like I said, it's the thing that really drove me to this point today where, you know, and I know one of the things we talked about is like, why did you end up in education? I mean, in a lot of ways, I think it was to address my own brokenness, right? It was to say, like, as a kid, I did well academically, but for some reason, and for so many people, that wasn't enough. I still was, you know, dark skinned. I still was, you know, in some people's eyes threatening. And at least I saw that picture, at least that was the image given to me. And as I got older, I started to say that I can control the narrative. I can rewrite the narrative about what it means to look like me in America. And that's really what has given me strength in this space and really has changed what my experience in education has been. Now, you know, I'm a person who's a huge believer in just understanding how do you self-educate and how do you go on your own educational journey to really uncover knowledge that may not necessarily be accessible. And that's really where I'm trying to thrive, is how to support people and seeing the knowledge and wisdom that exists beyond just what they're learning in a formal setting.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing. Is anyone else able to jump in?
I'll just add on to what Carlin just shared, in that I saw some similarities in our education, in the sense that I was also pulled out sort of in elementary school and put into this special program. And I think what I'll just add on to what Carlin said is just how lonely that felt as a kid, you know, just feeling like, you know, as Carlin described, sort of straddling those two worlds, like being told that you talk white, but also, you know, in these classrooms with people that you're never really quite one of them, right? Like we were just in, like our families were just in different, you know, sort of financial situations. So it just felt really lonely. And it wasn't really until high school that I actually like felt like, oh, wow, I got like Black people here. And even though they weren't always necessarily in my classes, you know, I, you know, started to see some folks in my classes. So I think, you know, for me, one of the motivating forces for me in terms of why I want to work in education is I don't like that my educational experience was an exception, right? I was really I was the only Black person in that gifted program for years. And then even when I was in high school, I was the only Black person in my classes. And so I am grateful for the education that I got. It was excellent. However, it just should have been more broadly offered to my neighbors, people who grew up in my community, people who grew up I went to school here in Providence. So, other people who were on the South Side with me, that they just weren't there in my academic spaces. So I think it's really important that whatever, someone saw in me and sort of identified me and sort of pulled me out and gave me this great education, I really wish that happened to more students who look like me.
Chiara, can I jump in?
Please.
This is Keith. So I think I'm hearing a common theme because I too have had a similar experience in my educational background. I went to Providence schools. I'm born and raised Providence, so I'm a homegrown guy. Went to Providence schools from kindergarten through grade 7, grade 6 actually, and then my mom and dad pulled me out, put me in Catholic school from grades 7, 8, and 9. 10th grade, I went back to public schools. I went to Hope High School and graduated from Hope High School. So having started in public school, went to private Catholic school, back to public school, I became aware of the contrast and the difference in how education is carried out in those different settings. And so I saw that there was a difference sort of in the level of rigor, the level of expectation, particularly as a Black kid. And so I again understand that there's this difference, and everyone does not have access to the same opportunities to get the quality education that everyone should be afforded. But that's not what my educational background is, not necessarily what led me to this work. What led me to this work actually goes back to my community upbringing. I was born and raised in Fox Point. And through my coming of age years, we went through a period of gentrification, right? To change in my community. And for a variety of factors, my community was changed. It was gentrified. And the community as I knew it was over a period of time displaced out of the Cape Verdean community, Portuguese community. And so my family and friends of my family my parents were engaged in trying to fight back those forces of gentrification and try to empower the community to keep the community together. So I came of age watching that and hearing that and learning that and witnessing that struggle. And I remember some of my early mentors in that struggle telling me one time, why is this happening? And it was told to me, he said, there's one thing that you need to understand and realize, that there are always going to be some people sitting in a room someplace that are making decisions that are going to affect your life. And you may not know it. You're not going to be a part of it. You're not going to know it until it happens to you, right? So that caused me to want to understand how does that happen. So I went to URI to study urban public policy, because that's what public policy is. Public policy is people sitting in a room somewhere that are making decisions that affect communities, right? And I wanted to understand how that worked. So I got a degree in urban public policy, and my first real job was as a community policy advocate for the Urban League of Rhode Island, because I was really interested in how policy affects communities of color, communities like where I grew up. And so my background was not necessarily through a traditional education background, but it was how policy affects communities writ large, particularly communities of color. And during that time, this is sort of the early to mid 90s, I began to focus on how policy not only affects the housing policy, economic development policy, minority business development policy, but how does education policy affect opportunities of communities where I came from? So that's what led me kind of to this work. At that time, I was involved in the startup of the Met School, right? I was involved in advocating for the first charter school law in 1995 when enabling legislation was passed. And my interest was how can we empower communities to take some ownership of some of these decisions that affect our community, right? And that's always been sort of the driving factor of the positions that I've taken, the role that I've played over, a 20-year career. Is it's about community empowerment. And when the idea of the concept of charter schools was first proposed as a concept, as an idea, it was interesting to me. It spoke to my sense of community empowerment, because what charter schools actually are, and I think Segway is a perfect example of this, and by extension, Legacy High School. What it is the community saying, we are going to take ownership. We are going to be empowered to take ownership of the education of our kids, the kids in our community. And I was at the Department of Education prior to my position here. I served 10 years in the Department of Education as the charter schools coordinator. So I was there to help facilitate the authorization of Segway in those early years. And the reason that we did was because of this particular point. The Segway school was started by the idea as from a community center, a community saying, these are our kids. We're going to take ownership of the education. We're taking on that responsibility and we're going to own it. And that spoke to me because that is empowerment. That is genuine community empowerment. And so my approach to education, my entry into education is from that viewpoint. No longer having to rely on the traditional educational systems that in many ways has not served our community well, but be able to take ownership for ourselves. And use this model to develop communities, learning communities that really do serve our community. So that's how I came to this work.
Keith, I'm going to jump in and talk about tradition and education in terms of structure. I grew up in Botswana, Southern Africa. So education had to come from a place of structure, of learning, and students who excelled were good students, who adhered to policies, who adhered to behavioral norms. It wasn't until I left that we went to I attended a predominantly what they call a private school. So what it is we have our traditional models with our schools, and then you have schools where parents pay a fee, like parochial schools here. And it was not until I left that school system that I realized that there was a lot of things that were dysfunctional about the education that I was receiving. I was taught that the best education or the best place to be was to embrace whiteness, because without that, I was not going to be successful. So when I came into the field of education, I made it the quest that I would provide education that respected and validated our students as well as our families. My parents would drop me off and they believed in that system when I was a child. They believed that the teachers had the best interest for me and my growth. And I think as we navigate systems right now and we truly know what the status of education, we have the power to not only have these conversations, but to execute action. I always ask when we talk about, injustice, when we talk about inequality, I talk about what's next. I always wonder what's next. So if the next step is to create a place where our students, where our communities can grow and have that power to make those educational systems, then I'm here for it.
If I can just jump in just to add there, I wasn't growing up, I wasn't placed in any like, gifted program or anything of the sort. I did go to school when tracking was like like a big thing. And so I've always been like middle of the road, um, sitting down there bored, asking for more. Then they give me a little bit more, but never was really like good enough to break into, some of the we had tracking between 1 and 10. And you can imagine ones being like the top notch, tens being, you know, nothing really happens in those classrooms. And so was never really good enough to be in that like 1 to 3 upper echelon. But that was in like middle school. It wasn't until high school was when I kind of thought about what I wanted to do, obviously, and as far as being successful in school. And I grew up in a strict house. My parents was first generation. My parents are straight from West Africa. And so they played absolutely zero games, right? C's weren't accepted in my house. And so that kept me on top of my game. So if I wanted to play basketball, I better be getting A's and B's. If I wanted to go to the school dance, hello, somebody, I had to get A's and B's, right? So, and so that kind of kept me, that kept me, going, and that kept me kind of keeping the bar high and reaching for um, things that I thought, or grades that I thought would bring me into certain success. And I also believed my teachers, where it's like, hey, if you get A's and B's, you have great opportunities for different colleges, so on and so forth. My parents put me in the Upper Bound program because I'm born and raised in Rhode Island. All of my schooling has been in Pawtucket. And so went to Upper Bound, which that was another layer of accountability that also helped me in achieving the things that I wanted to achieve. But I feel like where the turning point was for me was I had one of my guidance counselors in high school told her that I wanted to apply to Boston College, and she told me that I shouldn't apply to Boston College because I wouldn't get in. And I didn't understand, because it's like, hey, you told me to get A's and B's, so I'm part of the National Honor Society. I get perfect attendance almost every year. I only miss one day of school in high school, and that's because I broke my nose in basketball practice. And I wanted to go to school the next day, but the doctor said I couldn't, right? And so like I did everything that you told me to do. And here I'm saying like, here is another opportunity for me to engage in higher learning and challenging myself, and you're telling me that I'm not good enough. But my counselor from Upper Bound said, hey, let's go for it. You put in the work, let's go for it, let's see where we go. And that's the shift that I needed, because I applied and I got into Boston College, and I wanted to be petty and bring the acceptance letter and be like, hey, look, but that's not something that I did, because I didn't do it for her. I did it for me. And I'm going to be 36 in September, and I still remember her name, and I still remember that experience. Now imagine the number of kids that are being told that they're not good enough by X amount of folks, and how many of those people do our kids like remember even years after that? Like, this lady could be long and like she could be dead and gone. You're right, like she cannot be here anymore, but I still remember her. And my fondest and the memory that I have that is like etched into my head is her telling me that I'm not good enough. And she's supposed to be one of the educators that was supposed to pour into me. And so part of me coming into education is me saying, okay, well, in what ways can I encourage our young people, especially the ones that look like me, they are good enough. And even if something is a challenge, let's go ahead and let's try, and let's see where this thing takes us. Another part of it is when I come back, or when I run into my old teachers and I tell them, and they're like, hey, how's it going? And like, what happened after high school? And I tell them, hey, graduated from Boston College. I got my master's degree from Tufts. And now I work in education. It's like they're shocked. And like I have to step back and say, okay, well, if you're shocked to hear that I'm doing something that I love and something that I find, makes me successful and defines me as successful, what was your expectation of me from the beginning? And so again, part of what I want to do in education, and part of the reason why I'm here is to let our kids know that it should be the norm. That if you set your heart out for something, or if you set your mind to something, that you go out and you conquer it, whether it's education or whether it's something else. And then understanding where I am as a Black male, and understanding that, we are literal unicorns, right? We don't really see us in many places, compared to some of our other colleagues. Just want to let young men, young boys know that it's okay to empower your community from this seat.
Can I jump in there? Like, Jermaine, first of all, I find you all to be incredibly inspirational. I'm just sitting back and like, especially Jermaine, as you shared your story, our stories align so much. And part of it is because I was also born and bred in Pawtucket in Central Falls. And so I am also first generation. My parents are from Colombia. My mom, incredibly strict when it came to education. A minuses were not A's, and so fix it. My dad dropped out of elementary school in Colombia. And so he had no idea about education in Colombia or in America. And so my mom, though, was the one that stayed on top of making sure that we were doing our part in school. When I think about kind of school overall, for me, I use the word like disengaged. I think education was like done to us. We weren't really brought to the table. We weren't really, parents and families weren't really engaged and brought in to discuss like our successes in school, our challenges. I don't even recall a teacher ever calling home to let my parents know what was going on in school. I was completely unaware of my own skills, my own talents, my own abilities. So I never knew. Growing from K to 12, I had no idea that I was intelligent. I had no idea that I had the capacity to graduate college. Like I never was aware until I actually went to college. And college is where I really found like academic success. It's where I started realizing, and I think one moment that I remember was my first year of school. I was in a science lab. People were getting to know me. I shared that I was from Central Falls. There was a question that the professor asked. Of course, I'm trying to shine in college, right? And I did all my readings because I always do. And I was able to answer the professor's questions, and the professor was loving it because I was engaged and I was sharing my knowledge. And I remember two students turning around and saying, wow, like you're really smart for being from Central Falls. And that pissed me off. I think that's what, and I turned around and said, just turn around and don't talk to me. Like, we're not friends. Don't engage me. We're done. And so, for me in that moment, I think that was always the thing that drove me to graduate. Those moments I wanted to drop out, those moments that I found challenging. It was those kind of pieces. And to be honest, like for school, I always wanted to be successful. I always wanted to feel capable. There were moments where what I call confidence busters, being put in an ESL class because my last name is Montoya, knowing that I can full on read. My parents made sure that I spoke English and Spanish fluently, but to be put in an ESL strictly classroom for me was a confidence buster, because as I aged up, I didn't know I was good at reading. And so that was really challenging. And then like Jermaine, middle school was horrible. It was like the biggest confidence buster because, there were a lot of things that were going on. The tracking system, the 1 to 10 was brutal because I found myself right in the middle and wanting to be the 1, the 2, and the 3. But realizing that I would be leaving friends that looked like me. And as I moved up, they were white students. At 1s and 2s and 3s were all white students. And I wasn't sure if I wanted to do that. And kind of being conflicted, but realizing that I deserved to be there. And so I advocated. It was the first time I ever advocated. And they placed me in the 3s. And it was like a whole nother world, another tier of teaching, another set of expectations that we weren't getting. And as you work your way from 5 to 10s, the shade changed. And it was the first time that when I reflect back, I was like, wow, that is the issue with education. Because they attach a level of intelligence based on the color of your skin. And that was the first time that I was exposed to that, you know? And then I think where I really kind of struggled in high school is that no one was talking to me about like higher ed. Nobody was talking to me about college. Nobody was talking to me about careers. Nobody was helping me navigate that. You know, I was first generation. And so access to college wasn't a conversation they specifically had with me. And, you know, my dad was arrested when I was younger, when I was a kid. I witnessed it, right? It was traumatizing. And then going to school, like no one knew that. And so, and I struggled with that, and I still struggle with that, right? But I think ultimately what I'm trying to get at is our families are disengaged. Our schools don't bring us to the table, right? They don't work to meet our needs, and that's tough. And that's where I find myself blessed, because I didn't have a mental model as I was becoming a teacher. I didn't have another male educator that was Latino. I was the first for our kids too. And so not having that mental model of what a Latino educator is for our kids was hard, because you're trying to figure out what I represent for my kids and my families. And so, you know, and then being blessed to work at Segway provided me a mental model of what education could have been like for me, and it wasn't. And being blessed to be able to offer that for our families. So.
Just want to provide a different perspective. This has been so enriching so far. So I grew up in Boston and moved here when I was 10 years old, but I distinctly remember my educational experience in Boston compared to Rhode Island. And I say that because in Boston, I remember feeling encouraged, feeling invigorated. Hold on, can we go somewhere tonight? I'm in a meeting right now. Excuse me, my nephew's here. And so I remember, you know, feeling challenged. I remember being a part of the gifted program and feeling like there was nothing that I could not do. I could reach for the stars. I had the privilege to be a part of a pretty diverse school at the time. I remember taking swimming classes. I remember firefighters coming and visiting with their fire trucks and teaching us about fire safety. I remember there being a lot of extracurricular activities, even after school, that, you know, if you wanted to participate, you could. It wasn't one where you necessarily were placed in some of those after school extracurricular activities. So I remember just going to a session around English and literature and writing, even though I was a pretty good writer myself, but just being with other students, other kids really helped me in that area. And it also helped, you know, just build up some of the social emotional learning pieces for me. And then we moved to Rhode Island, we moved to Providence. And I remember being in the 5th grade and my peers learning about factors for the first time and division for the first time. And I distinctly looked around and I remember saying to myself, like, I learned this in the 3rd grade. Like, what is happening right now? And so with that, of course, the teacher recognizing that I knew some of the content, here I was placed as basically like the peer tutor. So I wasn't really learning much of anything else that was really new, because I already knew some of the material. And so that was a pattern throughout the years going, you know, to middle school and even high school. You know, I did get into classical high school, again, with the hope of, you know, just being the first person in my family to, I wasn't the first person in my family to go to college, but the first person in my family to at least go to an Ivy League institution was part of the goal for me. And I just remember going to classical, being there, getting, 2.5, 3 hours of homework a day, being in a college preparatory high school. And then we moved to Pawtucket, and I no longer was qualified to go to classical high school. So going to Shea High School is now a huge culture shock for me, because here I am with people who look even more like me, right? Being Cape Verdean American, but realizing that now I'm in a space with a lot of newcomers, and there isn't as much support that I had before. And not only was I dealing with that piece, but also just dealing with the fact that, my guidance counselor just put me in a regular track. And it wasn't until I took a public speaking class, and my public speaking teacher at the time, Miss Lawrence, she looked at me and she asked me why I was in the general track, which is a whole nother piece of it. And I looked at her and I said, I was placed here. And she was like, well, you transferred from classical, you should at least be a part of the AP track. So she literally advocated for me to join the AP track. And I think with that, it just made me think about how important it is to have supports for students, to have people who really advocate for students, who see each child individually, each student individually. And I'm a huge proponent of pathways for this reason, providing students with the tools, with the resources, with the knowledge that they need in order to make the decisions that are best for them. And then with that, I had a good friend who went to college early. I didn't even know early college was a thing until she told me about it. And talking to her, and she was so excited, and she was like, CCRI has, Running Start, and, Johnson & Wales has this other early college program. And I'm like, I didn't even know about this. I wish I knew about it. So I had applied to go to CCRI, and come to find out the application for that particular program was outdated. The application I received from the guidance counselor was outdated. So that was really frustrating for me, because I'm like, I'm putting my future literally in your hands, and you can't even have an application that's up to date with the correct due date. And so with that, I pivoted and went to Johnson & Wales, just to be able to be in a space where, like, I felt like I was college ready, but no one was telling me that I was college ready. And then even dealing with my parents, who were like, wait, you didn't graduate high school yet, how are you going to college? And that was a whole nother conversation, right? Like, my dad didn't even want to sign the financial paperwork, because he is like, wait, this doesn't make sense to me. So again, going back to educating parents and guardians and letting them know the options that their children and that their students have. And so with that, I just clearly remember being in spaces where my peers were not getting the support that they needed. No one knew much of anything that was going on. And how were we supposed to make decisions about our futures, especially about post-secondary education, or even going into a trade, et cetera, without having the resources and the information that was needed? So for me, student agency and advocacy is huge, but also the community engagement pieces, where parents and guardians know about options, is super important, because again, and I'm a parent myself, as a parent, your child the best, hopefully you do. And it's literally about building up a community, or having a community around you to propel you forward. And I also had a really great mentor in high school who, was a white lady, and she invested in me. And she is a true ally to this day. She takes, she's a friend of mine now, not so much a mentor, but a friend now. But when, how do we really bridge the gap, and how do we assess and think about people in our lives who have influence and who can be allies, and what are they doing to push people like us forward, and thinking about how to break some of those generational curses, to break poverty, break, the socioeconomic statuses moving forward. And so looking back on my experience, it was really frustrating for a lot of different reasons. But I never felt like I had the full information or access or understanding of what was happening, so that I can make the right decisions moving forward, especially being, a daughter of an immigrant who doesn't speak any English. I was the person translating all of the welfare paperwork for her, all the letters, and what that means for our families moving forward. And so just bringing that perspective to it in terms of newcomers and immigrants, and how a lot of times, we're the population that, we're left out, and how having really, really strong supports can make a difference.
A lot of similar themes here. It's again great to be here and great to hear these stories. So similarly, I think my middle school career, I was absent most of the time. I would say that pretty consistently. I just wasn't there, didn't show up. Hung out in the community, played basketball. I think I was both blessing and a curse with athletics. I think I got a lot of passes, a lot of enabling by my teachers that all the way up through high school. Just let him go as long as he's here. He's fast and plays sports. So it was. I don't think I realized how much education meant until I got to college and ended up in night school. And that's how I kind of brought education back into my life, because I really didn't see much value in it. I didn't see that people like myself, regardless of what education they got, ended up in the places that white folk showed up at and ended up at. And it took that, I would say, to get me to even think about that education was valuable. I remember in 8th grade, because of my absences, I think I was sent to various, detention, suspensions, all those type of things. And social worker, I think, was assigned to me, and they, like, all of you went through those tests. I had no idea they were, tests for gifted and talented programs. But at the time, they didn't tell me what my scores were, what my IQ was, any of those type of things, any of those metrics. But later on, when I went back to view my file, I easily qualified for, twice gifted and talented programs with the IQ I had. And they told my mother, but I remember them telling my mother when I finally talked to her about it. She said that, this was very common at the time, where you didn't want a kid to know their IQ, because if it was too low, it was this predictive value where they would never feel like they could accomplish anything. But if it was too high, then they might get a little too confident and not work as hard. So they kept it from me. And because of that, I ended up in a special education classroom where I wasn't really given any supports, but I remember I was given a lot of directions on, showing up for school, being on time, things like that. And at the time, I was being recruited by various high schools to play football, and one of them was a Catholic school. So I quickly realized, using this unknown, gifted and talented brain, that if I go to Catholic school, all of a sudden I don't have a disability. All of a sudden I am not qualified because they don't have those programs, and I could just go to regular classrooms and be a normal student from there on out. So I quickly signed up for that, went to Catholic school for a little while, slipped my disability label, and then went on with that. But as far as my father was incarcerated for a while in middle school. I'm sure that had something to do with my disengagement with things, and looking at the students I ended up teaching in the Albuquerque public schools, which, as we know, New Mexico has the highest poverty in the United States and the highest child poverty in the United States, and you are more likely to have concerns about food in New Mexico more than anywhere else in the United States. So I got to see many students like myself, and because it was a majority Latino state, I actually was like, wow, this might be what privilege looks like. This might be what I was used to seeing in the Northeast with my white counterparts, where the mayor was Latino, the banker was, so was the barber, so was everybody in town. And I got to see, like, this is what a community looks like when they're given resources. They could be anything. They could be a lawyer, they can be a professor, they can be all of these things, which got me to go back and get a couple more degrees. So at this point, looking back on the way I went through, or was a consumer of education, I just think I was lucky. I really do. I think I was lucky, and you know, obviously the enabling wasn't good, where people were like, okay, if he skips a few classes, we'll keep him around. But it got me through, and I'm hoping that at some point, you know, the education system around, because when I got here, I was also a bit horrified, to be honest. I was really horrified at the low expectations of people of color, where that was not happening in Albuquerque at all. And to see just my colleagues in higher ed also enabling people of color, having low expectations of people of color, and assuming that people of color needed them to succeed when they're perfectly capable all by themselves, as we know. And as far as, you know, at the university level, that's my job, I feel, is that any Black or brown person coming through Providence College, I am there to process what they're seeing, what they're reading, what they're analyzing, and then also to tell them, A, they belong here, and B, you do not have to be like anybody else at our college. You can be yourself. You've got strengths, and use them, run with them. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone, for all of your thoughts. We don't have a ton of time. I want to be mindful of it. So I have one follow-up question that I'm hoping to ask that we can have a little bit more rapid fire discussion about. And then I want to make sure there's time for Dr. Lourenco to just give us an overview of some next steps coming out of this conversation. So my final follow-up question for all of you is, given that the experiences that you described are not all necessarily positive, and that we know that many students are still, especially in the urban core, are still experiencing those same challenges. Why would you encourage a student to commit their life to education? Why and how might you have a conversation with a young person about how they can invest their time and their interest into a community or a space that hasn't necessarily laid the foundation for them to feel like it's a safe space already? So I'll kick that back to the group.
Well, I think that folks, I would encourage, if kids were inclined to get involved in education, is because of the impact that they can have on the life outcomes of the kids that are going to be in their charge. We all talked about, we're just talking about sort of that, there's this thing called the soft bigotry of low expectations, particularly when it comes to kids of color. And to go into education as a person of color, you can intercede in some of that soft bigotry of low expectation, because you can have high expectations for the kids that are going to be in your charge. So you can have an impact in your own way to sort of to break that cycle, and to show kids that there is a path that you can go on to do great things, and that you can show yourself as an example of how you can go and do great things, and set a bar of high expectation. So that's one of the reasons why I would encourage more kids of color to go into this profession, because they can have that impact.
Yeah, just to add, I think my perspective is like it's like a tad bit different, but I think it complements what was just said. I think not only is work like this great because of the impact, I also think from my experience that, you know, I've discovered that, you know, this is like, for me, it's a calling. And I'm a preacher, so I get a little preachy at times, so please forgive me. But I think it's a calling. I think it's a calling, you know, at least for me, because I didn't want to go into education. Like, my parents was like, listen, you're going to be a doctor, you're going to be a lawyer, you're going to be a dentist or some type of surgeon, because that's where the money is. when I told them that I was going to be a 7th grade reading teacher, they looked at me and was like, the first question they asked is, how much you getting paid? And I was like, not a lot, right? So what what brought me there was the fact that, you know, before I even made the decision of being a 7th grade teacher, I look back and I said, well, everything that I did from when I was my volunteer work in college, some of the natural reaction, some of the like just the natural work that I've done, you know, from day to day, from the stuff that I've done in church, like a lot of it has been centered around the youth. And so it's like, well, it makes sense, right, that my calling has found me. So I think part of it is like, you know, yes, we encourage our young people that this is an option, but then I think that like we just need to provide options like Legacy High School so that their calling could find them. They can have more opportunities for their calling to find them. And I think that that's important.
I think.
I love. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, Mimi. Go ahead, Mimi.
Go ahead. I'll let you go ahead.
No, absolutely. I insist, please.
Kim, you're on.
Go ahead, Kim.
Okay, thank you. So I just loved that idea that Jermaine just shared about this being a calling, and it's okay to preach. We'll be your amen corner over here. But yeah, so it's funny because I never imagined I'd be in education. I took the most circuitous route to working in education that you can imagine, by way of theater and politics and then education. But so I think what I would share is that there's a role to play for a lot of people, right? You don't necessarily have to be a teacher, but it does, or sort of come to education through that sort of more traditional route. But it matters who's at the table, right? So if you think about, you know, finance decisions, right? Like who gets to decide where the money goes is a really big decision. You don't have to be a teacher to be at that table to make that decision. You actually need a finance background, right? So there's all different ways that people can come at this, you know, policy, you know, I sort of came policy type of work. But there, you know, we need communications people. There's all sorts of different ways that you can be involved. But you know, if you have that calling, you know, if you have that, you know, desire to work with kids or around kids or for kids, then you know, I think there's a place for everybody here somewhere to be working in education.
The most difficult piece of the work that I do is when I'm in the office at my school and students come in and they say, this is the first time I've seen a Black person throughout my school life in your position. And then I think of not only my role, but what they're seeing, what they're feeling, and it's validation that this exists in this space. So it's important that they continue so that we continue to live and education looks like them. Because if you navigate spaces from kindergarten and you don't see anyone that looks like you or comes from your community, you don't see someone who can say, hey, let's go you've been to Compare Foods, it's changed now, by the way. You live in this isolation that education does not exist and you're not part of it. So to have someone who looks like you, where you can come in and say, hey, Miss Ziyani, today I experienced microaggression, it's huge. So we all have a responsibility, our students and families all have a responsibility to make sure that education exists and it's accessible, it's attainable, and it's normalized.
Yeah, I think similar to, you know, Jermaine had mentioned it, and Kim and also Mimi, you know, I usually joke with folks and say, you know, I didn't choose education, education chose me. This wasn't a path I saw for myself, something I envisioned, something I took the steps that kind of just fell in my lap. And it really was solely because I just wanted to help people. I wanted to do good. I wanted to make an impact. I wanted to make a change, et cetera. And my vessel just happened to be education. So I think more or less, I think, and a lot of folks I think talk to have similar stories on how they end up in education is they just want to have an impact. And I think for me, there's so many different ways you could do it. You know, it could be in a political realm, community organizing, et cetera. But I think for me, and I want to stay away from the term, the ultimate equalizer, because there is certain places where even education won't get us through the door. But I think in a lot of senses, education is the equalizer in a lot of ways. And I want folks in our communities to know that, feel that, and understand that. And be empowered by that, you know, the more they educate themselves, the more things they learn, the more opportunities they get. And maybe those obstacles don't go away, but maybe they come a little lower to the ground. They're easier to navigate, et cetera. So that's kind of how I ended up here. And it's funny because I'm at a nonprofit. I'm with On Where We Learn, which formerly the College Crusade. And obviously I love the work we do, but and in some ways I look forward to the days where we aren't needed in a sense. You know, we don't need to have a community group or a nonprofit come in and fill some of those holes and gaps. I want that to happen organically in the school, through the systems, in our communities. And I think, you know, things like this are how we get there. And just conversations like this, and the ultimate goal of this session, I think, is how we get there. And that's what excites me and wants to continue and move forward and have that, because you have these conversations and it just kind of recharges the battery, makes everybody kind of feel refreshed, knowing that, you know, we have folks that are like-minded and want the same goals and are pushing and kind of have the same charge in front of them. So.
Appreciate y'all sharing that. And, you know, one thing I add is just like, I used to run an after school, summer school program that employed high school and college students to run our programming. And before they worked for us, there was no amount of words that I could give them that convinced them to go into education. Like, I'll talk to them like, nah, that's not for me, man. No, I'm good. No, that's too stressful. My teachers look stressed. I'll be stressed by my teachers, you know what I mean? And it's not until they actually had the experience of like working in that setting did they say like, you know, I never thought about this. This actually might be a cool experience. You know, I remember even for myself, I never thought about being a teacher, but then someone was like, hey, have you heard of this program that provides in-school tutoring, before school support, behavior support with students? And I was like, nah, I haven't. I apply for it. I applied for it. And I was like, oh, I like working with kids. And I said, okay, I'll become a teacher. Love that. Then got into the nonprofit space, right? But it was all because I got these experiences that actually allowed me to see what it was like. So it was like, there was no amount of words even for myself that could convince me that, yeah, go build a career in education. But it wasn't until I actually experienced it that it actually made sense to me. And it's like, for me, it's about moving at the speed of trust. So for young people, how do we move at the speed of trust so that we give them just step by step? Like, if we want them to go consider career in education, what are the things we can do to actually get them in a space where they can experience it for themselves and then make their decision from there, right? Because a lot of young people just like, you know, everybody's trying to figure out what they want to do in life. I mean, I know people who are in their 60s, 70s, 80s who after COVID especially were like, I don't even know what I want to do in my life, right? So it's like giving folks the experience to actually to see it for themselves.
Great. So I'm gonna just take two last comments from David and then Nicholas, and then I'm gonna pass it back over to Dr. Lourenco. So David, if you want to jump in.
Thank you. This has been so inspiring. I just want to put that out there. I feel like so much love in this room, and I'm grateful to be part of it. I've been thinking about this in a different context, but I was at Segway yesterday, and I said something to the teachers who were gathered for professional development. What really excites me about legacy, the concept, is the fact that school right now is a place where we inculcate kids into ableism and ageism, right? That it is the primary space where kids learn their relative lack of agency and authority with respect to their age and with respect to their God-given gifts, which we, I think, squander relentlessly. So to flip the script and to give them the opportunities to envision themselves as agents of radical, social change is just beyond exciting to me. So thank you for all of this.
Nicholas, did you still want to add?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I wasn't sure if there was time. First of all, just thank everybody for sharing your story today. Huge positive for my morning. So thank you for that. But to that last question, I think there's so much power in helping kids help themselves and help their friends. I'm a middle school assistant principal right now, and I think that's the best way that I get through to them is I teach them something about themselves that they could share. And I think if we can do that, we can build a pretty large community. So I just wanted to add that little quick perception to this mix.
And I did get permission from Kiara to jump in really quickly, just thinking about this conversation and how essential career exploration is. If students don't know what's out there or what they can achieve or what they can do, how are they supposed to make an authentic choice? And also thinking about encouraging students to go into education, understanding their why, because on those hard days, you need to know why you're doing what you're doing. And you need to know how your role fits into the larger picture, and also being true to yourself. And so I remember for me, teaching my nieces and nephews, I have a large family, I'm the youngest of 10, so I have 33 nieces and nephews. Teaching them their ABCs, learning how to read, et cetera, came very naturally, but education didn't even dawn on me until I was working in corporate. And I told myself, like, I enjoy facilitating and teaching others, but I don't want to be in this corporate space. And then that's how I landed in education. So being true to themselves is really important. And having these conversations is a part of what is going to equip them moving forward. But definitely career exploration and them having the authentic choice piece is important.
Thank you so much, Wendy, and to everyone for just your authenticity, engaging in this conversation, being vulnerable. This is just the start of many conversations, and the hope is to take this energy and to channel it into a school design that really kind of flips the script and creates something new for students. So Dr. Lorenko is going to help close us out now, just speaking through the possibilities and what's next and how you can be involved.
So thank you, Kiara, and thank you everyone for being here today. It's so great to see familiar faces and new faces. So thank you all for sharing. And especially those last few comments kind of tie perfectly into what I'm going to share in like 2.5 minutes. So we are, in the beginning stages of formulating the framework for Legacy High School. And I think as we, have built this vision, it's the idea of like pulling back the curtain on teaching and learning for students. And one of my mantras this year is let's not do to students, let's do with students. And so helping to build with them, helping to build systems with them, helping to kind of say, this is how and why I designed this lesson plan the way that I did. Let's talk about it. Did it work? What worked? What didn't? Why did it work? Why didn't it work? And so that's going to sort of frame a lot of what we do at Segway going forward. But for Legacy High School, it's really going to be the foundation for our teachers as they engage our high school students. So the framework itself will obviously be centered around high school, regulations and making sure that all of our students are ready to and prepared to apply to, get into, and succeed in whatever college or career choice is next when they graduate Legacy High School. And exactly what some of you said at the beginning, which is that in order to affect education for students, you do not have to just be a classroom teacher. Obviously, that pipeline right now is dry, and we need to infuse that with wonderful people who are ready to do the hard and important work in the right way for students. And so that's, a core piece of what we'll do. But we envision, graduating students who are ready to jump into finance careers and people that are ready to jump into education policy and politics and social work and human services, as well as, traditional classroom teachers. So that way the landscape of education is changing as a result of these graduates jumping into the workforce, and also into higher ed, because as we work with teachers, as administrators, and our teachers talk to us about the gaps that they have from their ed prep programs, it's important that these graduates have, a foundation that helps them to say, when they get into, a higher ed class, like, that's not really updated research. And here's how I know, because when I was in high school, we were learning about brain research and the science of reading. So in classes that are sort of your traditional high school classes, like a biology or a history course, we will be integrating lots of current, educational research into those classes, so that students are learning biology, but there's a huge focus on brain development and trauma-informed teaching and learning. And so what do we, how do we shape classrooms that work for every student, regardless of, their background, regardless of, where they're coming to us from? And that's what we try to do at Segway every single day. And so that will be a huge, core of what we do at Legacy High School. And then, we will have a course that will prepare students for the field of education. So it will kind of grow as we grow up. So in the beginning, when students are freshmen and they're just in high school, not knowing, someone said, I'm 41 and I'm very lucky that I have found what I wanted to be when I grow up. But that's not the case for everybody. So, saying to a student in freshman year, we're going to give you the exposure to all of the wonderful and amazing careers out there that do, impact education, and kind of being very general in that first year. And then as students grow, they will be able to sort of narrow down, where is my focus, and what does that look like? We are having conversations with several national partner programs that offer a teacher training, micro-credential kind of a program for students in high school. So we've talked to, or we'll be talking to folks from the Educators Rising program, Teacher Cadet, so a few different options that will let students, while they're in high school, work towards these micro-credentials in classroom culture and, writing a good lesson plan and understanding, who you are as an educator in front of students and understanding who your students are as individuals in front of you. And so that program is, something that we are trying to find the best fit. But like Mr. Garcia said at the very beginning, we know that there are pockets of, wonderful things happening connected to this work. So we want to invent something amazing, but we don't want to reinvent, a piece that's already out there. So kind of bringing in those partners that can really supplement this work is going to be awesome. We also are at the beginning stages of developing some partnerships that will get our students conditional acceptance into teacher prep programs. So I know we have Dr. Rodriguez here through PC, and they're a great partner with Segway already, as well as Rhode Island College and CCRI and URI and Roger Williams. So saying if our students, obviously do what they need to do, and we support them in the best way we can to, make sure they're ready for college, can a Segway Legacy High School graduate have conditional acceptance to these teacher prep programs? And that is something that we're having beginning conversations, but it's looking really promising. And then just having students all graduate with a career, kind of in. So all students that want to graduating with a paraprofessional certificate. So having that sort of first step in the door of a school or the field of education, that's kind of that's very important to us on the career track, getting students into the field. So that's sort of the general framework and different kind of pillars that we've been working towards right now. And again, I'm so excited that this group of people has been brought together, and so we are looking for folks to join us in a couple of different ways. I'm going to let Mr. Garcia talk about that. But opportunities to jump into a design team that would help us to kind of, build out these this vision and these ideas, and then also serving on different areas of a board of directors. We have to develop that as a charter school, and that's really important to what we're going to do. But again, thank you so much for being here this morning. That was longer than 2.5 minutes. I should have known better. But I'm going to hand it back to Mr. Garcia so he can talk about the group's next steps.
So thank you for that. And again, I just want to make sure that you all hear me when I say that we are eternally grateful for this dialogue. We have been doing a lot of this at Segway the last 3 weeks as part of our professional learning academy here, and really baring our souls and emptying our pockets and sharing our stories, and getting angry and crying and all of the above. But I can't tell you enough how much your stories are the ripples that we need to help get our students where we want them to be. I want to go back real quick to a comment that was made earlier, and I'm not sure if it was Jermaine or Carlin that made it, about helping teachers be ready for the work that needs to be done. And part of what we want to do with Legacy is to change how we suit their armor. What battle are they going into? And is that battle a just battle in the first place? So if I could leave you with one comment and one thought for you to think about is, as we look at education for our children, let's not only focus on making sure teachers aren't stressed out or that teachers aren't too underpaid or whatever, but more so focus on why has education failed our children? And why is it that we are here 30 years later still talking about education reform? And millions of dollars and books written, and that structure has not changed. And so from that course work that we will do, part of that will be you all are going to be the team that goes and shakes legislators out of their chairs. And let's start talking about what it is that we're doing. I am all about tipping cars over in the streets to get attention. Lord knows I have stepped in it enough. So I don't think rebellion is bad. So that'll be one course you could take your senior year at Legacy. But again, I want to thank you all so much. I really, really want to make sure that you know that you are appreciated. We will be reaching out to folks and sort of canvassing your level of interest. I ask that everyone within earshot of me remembers that once you speak it and you give it life, it gains momentum and energy in the universe. So talk about Legacy, mention it to people, share it with your network, because the more brains around the table, the more heads, the better we can be as a school. And so whether you choose to make today the only day you hang out with us, or whether or not you yourself may want to work at Legacy someday, please keep that and keep us in mind. Kiara, you have the last minute.
Great, thank you so much. So just reiterating, I'm going to follow up with this group to share out the design team application. We've really structured it not to be an application that's arduous or burdensome. It's really just a way to elevate, raise your hand and say, I'm interested in participating. And we also are going to be sending out a form for others that are interested in just raising their hand to stay updated in our process, but may not have the time or the interest level to be participating in the design team itself. We also will be leaning on you all and sharing opportunities for students to get involved. And so we haven't done a major outreach around the student design team yet, but when that happens, our goal is really to leverage the network of this group and others to identify students that might be interested in crafting the student experience element of the school, and really working through what the portrait of a graduate would look like from the perspective of students themselves. So more to come from us. Thank you everyone. Again, we want to be respectful of your time, 11:30 on the dot, so we'll let you go, but thank you, and please just let this be the start of a very long continued conversation.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.